Welcome to Cozy Mysteries with Alistair, where we settle into velvet armchairs, let the fire crackle, and allow the brilliant Hercule Poirot to do all the work while we simply enjoy the ride. I'm your host, Alistair Blackwood, speaking to you on this chilly November evening in 2025. Whether you're curled up under a blanket, walking the dog through autumn leaves, or, like half the comments last week, doing the ironing at midnight, do tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I read every single one, and it truly love knowing you're there. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Ravenswood Chase. The Bentley purred along the narrow Surrey lanes like a well-fed cat, scattering bronze leaves that had fallen in thick carpets overnight. It was the third week of October, 1928, and the air that slipped through the half-open window carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Hercule Poirot sat very upright in the back seat, gloved hands folded upon the silver knob of his cane, his hat balanced upon his knees with the precision of a museum piece. His expression was one of polite martyrdom. Captain Arthur Hastings at the wheel glanced in the driving mirror and grinned. "You look as though you're being taken to your own execution, Poirot." "Executions, my dear Hastings, are at least dry. This English countryside of yours is beautiful, yes, but it is also treacherous. Already the moisture creeps into the bones. I feel it in the little toe of my left foot. A tragedy." Hastings laughed. "We're nearly there. Ravenswood Chase is only another mile. Sir Reginald promised central heating in every room, electric light, and his exact words, not a single draught to disturb the comfort of the most fastidious Belgian." Poirot gave a delicate shudder. Modern comfort is all very well, but a house that does not breathe is a house without a soul. Still, one must be courteous. When Sir Reginald Ravenswood invites Hercule Poirot to spend the weekend, Hercule Poirot comes. The car swept between tall gateposts of honey-coloured stone and began to climb. Through the trees the house appeared in glimpses. First a gable, then a glint of glass, then an entire facade that seemed to belong to 3 different centuries at once. When at last they rounded the final bend, Hastings involuntarily slowed the car. Ravenswood Chase was astonishing. At its core stood the original Elizabethan manor, mellow brick, twisted into tall chimneys and shaped gables. But sprouting from this ancient trunk, as though the house had grown wild in the night, were white concrete wings, flat roofs, ribbons of steel-framed windows that caught the weak autumn sun and flung it back like blades. A medieval tower rose at one corner, yet its battlements had been sliced away and replaced by a roof garden of geometric box hedges. From the very top sprouted a slender wireless mast, silver against the pale sky. The effect was half dream, half challenge, as though Inigo Jones and Le Corbusier had quarrelled over the blueprints, and neither had been willing to yield. Hastings gave a low whistle. "Good Lord, it's magnificent." "It is certainly noticeable," Poirot murmured. A gravel sweep curved before the entrance. As the Bentley drew up, the great oak door, 15th century, iron-studded and quite dwarfed by a porch of gleaming chromium, swung open. A butler of awesome dignity descended the steps. "Captain Hastings, Monsieur Poirot, Sir Reginald is expecting you." They were led across a hall that perfectly illustrated the house's schizophrenia. Flagstones worn hollow by generations of Ravenswoods, beside a floor of black and white marble, laid only last spring. A vast Tudor fireplace, roaring with apple logs opposite a radiator disguised as a Greek frieze. On the walls hung both a Van Dyck portrait and an abstract painting in violent primary colours that made Poirot's moustache quiver with disapproval. Sir Reginald Ravenswood strode to meet them. He was 60, tall, silver-haired, with the face of a hawk that has learned to smile for photographers. His tweeds were Savile Row, his shoes handmade, and his handshake firm enough to remind one that he had once climbed the scaffolding of his own buildings in hobnailed boots. "Monsieur Poirot, 1,000 thanks for coming." His French accent was surprisingly good. "And Captain Hastings, I have followed both your careers with the greatest interest. Come, let me show you my folly before the rest of the party arrives." He led them through corridors where oak panelling gave way to pale sycamore, where a suit of armour stood beside a sculptural radiator that looked like a coiled serpent. They passed a kitchen of white tiles and shining copper, where American refrigerators hummed like contented bees, and a library whose shelves rose 3 stories yet could be reached by a moving ladder operated by electricity. At last, Sir Reginald threw open a low door at the base of the old tower. "And this, gentlemen, this is the heart of the matter." A narrow spiral stair of worn stone rose steeply. They climbed in single file. 20 steps up, another oak door confronted them, immensely thick, iron-bound, fitted with a gleaming modern Yale lock. Sir Reginald produced a key, turned it with a flourish, and pushed the door inward. The room beyond was circular, perhaps 20 feet across, lit by 4 deep arrow-slit windows that admitted thin blades of light. The walls were lined with cork and felt for soundproofing, then panelled in dark oak. Bookshelves, plan chests, a vast drawing board beneath a green-shaded lamp, and, dominating everything, a single leather armchair facing a fireplace of brutal simplicity. But it was the door that held Poirot's attention. On the inside, in addition to the Yale lock, ran a heavy steel bolt, thick as a man's wrist, that slid into a socket with the finality of a prison gate. Sir Reginald closed the door so they could appreciate the effect. "Observe," he said proudly, "once this bolt is thrown, from the inside, mark you, nothing on earth can open this door from without. Not force, not fire, not the entire Surrey Constabulary with a battering ram." The walls are lined with steel plate beneath the panelling. The arrow slits are 12 inches deep and 4 inches wide. I designed this room myself as the perfect retreat. When I wish to work undisturbed, I come here, I throw the bolt, and the world ceases to exist. Poirot walked slowly around the chamber, tapping the walls, peering up the chimney, running a gloved finger along the bolt. "Most ingenious," he said at last. "One might almost call it a challenge." Sir Reginald laughed. A sound like gravel poured into a bucket. "That is precisely why I invited you, Monsieur Poirot. For the past month I have been receiving anonymous letters. Your stolen triumph will be your tomb. The tower will be your mausoleum. Rather Gothic, don't you think? My wife is distressed. The servants are whispering. I myself refuse to be intimidated, but I confess I should like the idea of having the greatest detective in Europe under my roof this weekend, especially when I shall be working in here, behind my impregnable bolt, with the final plans for the new City Hall." He opened a drawer and showed them a Webley .455 revolver, ugly and efficient. "I shall keep this with me. One feels safer. Though between the bolt and Monsieur Poirot, I rather think any would-be assassin will have his work cut out." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "You issue a challenge to fate, Sir Reginald, and to Hercule Poirot. It is not wise. Pah! I have spent my life defying the impossible. This house is a proof of that. Now come, let me show you to your rooms. The rest of the party arrives this evening, and tomorrow I shall unveil the City Hall design that will make me immortal." As they descended the spiral stair, Poirot paused on the threshold of the door. "One small question, monsieur. This bolt, it slides easily?" "Like silk. I oiled it myself only yesterday." "And the key to the Yale lock, how many are there?" "Two. I have one. The other is in my desk in the library. No one else possesses a key." "Bien. One likes to be precise." Sir Reginald clapped him on the shoulder. "Tomorrow night after dinner I shall lock myself in with my drawings and a bottle of whisky. You may all sit downstairs and play bridge, safe in the knowledge that even if Jack the Ripper himself were loose in Surrey, your host would be perfectly secure behind steel and oak." Poirot permitted himself the ghost of a smile. "We shall see, mon ami," he said softly. "We shall see." Behind them, the heavy door swung shut with a thud that echoed like a premonition through the ancient stones of Ravenswood Chase. Chapter 2. The Guests Assemble. The long gallery at her Ravenswood Chase ran the entire length of the east wing, a tunnel of candlelight and shadows where Elizabethan ancestors glared down from the panelling, their ruffs stiff with disapproval at the electric bulbs hidden in the hammer beams above. At 8 o'clock precisely, the dinner gong boomed, and the house party drifted in like actors summoned to an uncomfortable play. Sir Reginald stood before the fireplace, a glass of champagne in one hand, the other thrust into his pocket in the attitude of a man who knows the stage belongs to him. He wore evening dress, as though it had been invented for his shoulders alone. Beside him, Lady Margaret Ravenswood glittered in emerald silk cut dangerously low. Her smile was bright, brittle, and never reached her eyes the colour of winter seas. "Margaret, my dear, you are ravishing," Sir Reginald said loudly, as though complimenting his own taste. She inclined her head with the faintest curve of scarlet lips, and moved away to accept a cocktail from the butler. Harold Ravenswood arrived next, already flushed, his white tie askew, smelling faintly of the decanters he had visited before coming downstairs. He was shorter than his brother, softer, with the same hawk nose ruined by broken capillaries. "Evening, evening," he muttered to no one in particular, and made straight for the whisky. Miss Clara Layton entered quietly, almost apologetically. She wore severe black relieved only by a single brooch of Whitby jet. Her brown hair was drawn back so tightly that it seemed to sharpen her features. Her eyes, behind rimless spectacles, flicked once around the room and catalogued every detail. She carried a small leather notebook and a silver propelling pencil, as other women carry fans. Lionel Forsyth glided in behind her, plump and prosperous, his bald head shining like a billiard ball under the lights. His smile arrived a fraction late, as though it had been posted from another room. "Reginald, old man," he boomed, "quite a gathering you've arranged. One feels positively wicked." Last came Julian Hale, the young assistant architect. He paused in the doorway as though unsure of his welcome, then stepped forward with the controlled violence of a man walking a tightrope above fury. His dress clothes were correct but slightly shabby at the cuffs. His dark hair fell across a forehead still pale from long nights over drawing boards. When Sir Reginald offered his hand, Julian took it for the briefest possible second, as though touching something hot. Hastings and I completed the circle. Poirot, impeccable in white tie and a waistcoat of dove grey, surveyed the company with bright, inquisitive eyes. He reminded me of a small black kitten in a basket of foxes. Dinner was announced. The dining room continued the house's theme of calculated shock. A refectory table, long enough for a medieval banquet, laid with modern glass and chromium, candles in silver candelabra beside electric wall sconces that looked like frozen lightning. Sir Reginald took his place at the head beneath a portrait of his great-grandfather in armour. The old warrior seemed to glower at the chromium salt cellars. Conversation began politely enough. The weather, the new bypass, the Prince of Wales's latest escapade. But beneath the clink of crystal, one felt the strain, like a wire drawn too tight. Sir Reginald was in exuberant form. On Monday, the judges announced the winner of the City Hall competition, he declared, raising his glass. And I think we all know whose name will be on their lips. Julian Hale's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Do we indeed, sir? The words fell into the sudden hush like a pebble into a pond. Lady Margaret's eyes flicked to Julian, lingered, returned to her plate. Harold Ravenswood reached hurriedly for the claret. Sir Reginald's smile did not waver. Come, Julian. You've been brooding all week. Out with it. Julian laid down his knife. Very well. 6 months ago, I showed you a set of sketches. Curves of glass, a spire of light, the whole building breathing with the river. You told me they were promising but immature. 3 weeks later, your own submission appears, my curves, my spire, my building, with your signature at the bottom. A small, shocked sound escaped Clara Layton. Lionel Forsyth coughed into his napkin. Sir Reginald leaned back, amused. My dear boy, great minds think alike. I took your crude notions and refined them, as a master should. You ought to be grateful. Grateful. Julian's voice shook. You've stolen my future. Lady Margaret's hand moved across the tablecloth, as though to touch Julian's sleeve, then withdrew. Harold Ravenswood gave a nervous laugh. Bit strong, old chap. Have some more wine. But Julian was beyond wine. When they unveil your City Hall, the world will applaud Sir Reginald Ravenswood. And I will still be fetching your pencils. Sir Reginald's eyes turned cold. Enough! You are a guest in my house. Am I? Julian stood so abruptly his chair rocked. Or merely an embarrassment to be silenced? He strode from the room. The door closed behind him with a soft, expensive click. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sir Reginald shrugged. Youthful temperament, he will calm down. Lady Margaret rose. If you will excuse me, I have a headache. Her departure was less dramatic than Julian's, but somehow more final. The rest of the meal passed in uneasy small talk. Coffee was served in the drawing-room, but the party had lost its savour. At 10:30, Sir Reginald stood. I have work to finish, the final presentation drawings for Monday. I shall take them to my tower room. Do not wait up. I may be some hours. He crossed to a small wall safe concealed behind a tapestry, opened it, and removed a thick portfolio tied with black tape. From a drawer in the hall table, he took the heavy Webley revolver. One feels safer with these letters about, he said lightly. Good night, all. We watched him cross the hall and disappear through the low door at the base of the tower. Minutes later came the faint sounds we had been told to expect. The creak of the spiral stair, the slam of the oak door, click of the Yale lock, and finally, unmistakable, the heavy scrape of the steel bolt sliding home. The house seemed to exhale. Harold Ravenswood poured himself a large whisky and did not offer the decanter to anyone else. Clara Layton opened her little notebook, wrote 3 words, closed it, and went quietly upstairs. Lionel Forsyth lit a cigar and stared into the fire as though answers might be found among the coals. Lady Margaret did not reappear. Hastings looked at me and raised an eyebrow. I looked at Poirot. Poirot merely stroked his moustache and smiled the small, contented smile of a man who has seen the first thread appear in a tapestry he intends to unravel. Somewhere above us, behind steel and oak and centuries of stone, Sir Reginald Ravenswood began what he believed would be a night of undisturbed triumph. Chapter 3. The Tower Room. The house slept uneasily. Clocks ticked too loudly in the corridors. Somewhere a shutter banged in the wind that had risen after midnight. I read for an hour by the green-shaded lamp in my bedroom, but the words refused to settle. At 29 minutes past 11, I laid the book aside and listened to the silence. It was broken by a single, flat report, sharp as a whip crack yet oddly muffled, coming from the direction of the old tower. One shot, nothing more. I was already pulling on my dressing gown when Hastings burst in without knocking, hair on end, revolver in hand. "That was a gun, Poirot." "Précisément." Poirot had appeared behind him, fully dressed, shoes shining, not a crease disturbed. "Come." We met the others in the hall as though a silent alarm had rung in every room. Harold Ravenswood, purple-faced in a tartan dressing gown, clutched a poker. Lionel Forsyth, plump even in pyjamas, was trying to light a cigar with shaking hands. Clara Layton stood at the foot of the stairs, notebook clutched to her chest like a shield. Lady Margaret, white as parchment in a jade silk wrapper, pressed both hands to her mouth. Julian Hale came last, barefoot, shirt open at the throat, eyes wild. "The tower," he said. "It came from the tower." We ran. The stone corridor to the tower door was cold. Our breath smoked. The low oak door at the foot of the spiral stair stood ajar, exactly as Sir Reginald had left it hours earlier. Above, 20 steps up, the inner door, thick, iron-bound medieval, was shut fast. "Sir Reginald!" Julian shouted up the stairwell. His voice cracked. "Sir Reginald, open the door!" Only the wind answered, rattling the arrow slits high above. Harold began to hammer on the lower door with the poker. "Reggie! Reggie, man! Answer us!" "Nothing, lady." Margaret found her voice. "Break it down! For God's sake, break it in!" The butler and 2 footmen, roused from their quarters, arrived panting with a heavy oak bench from the hall. 4 men took the weight. They charged the upper door. The first impact shook dust from the stones. The second splintered wood around the Yale lock. The third seemed to achieve nothing at all, for the door opened 6 inches and jerked to a violent stop. The great steel bolt still held firm on the inside. "Impossible," Forsyth whispered. They fetched an axe from the stables. The blade bit deep, showering splinters. At the 7th stroke, the bolt sheared with a metallic scream. The door swung inward. A wave of warm air rolled out, smelling of whiskey, cigar smoke, and something sharper, cordite. The tower room was exactly as Sir Reginald had left it. Green lamp burning on the drawing board, portfolio open, sheets of tracing paper weighted with brass rules. The fire had burned low, but still lived. And at the desk, beneath the lamp's cone of light, sat Sir Reginald Ravenswood. He was slumped forward, forehead resting on the leather-topped desk, as though asleep over his work. A thin ribbon of blood had run from his right temple, across the blotting paper, and dripped, slow, onto the Persian rug. His right hand hung limp. Beneath it, on the floor, lay the heavy Webley, 1 cartridge discharged. On the typewriter, a machine he famously loathed, a single sheet protruded. "I can bear the shame no longer. Forgive me." R.R. The room was silent, except for the small ticking of a travelling clock on the mantel. Julian Hale made a sound like a wounded animal and started forward. Poirot caught his arm. "Non, monsieur. Touch nothing." Poirot stepped carefully around the desk, eyes glittering. He bent, studied the wound, the position of the revolver, the angle of the head. He touched nothing. yet one could almost see the little grey cells dancing. Lady Margaret began to cry, soft, tearing sobs that seemed to surprise even herself. Harold Ravenswood stared at his brother as though waiting for him to sit up and laugh at the joke. Clara Layton opened her notebook with steady fingers and wrote a single line. Poirot straightened. Captain Hastings, be so good as to telephone the local police. Tell them Sir Reginald Ravenswood has apparently taken his own life. Apparently? Julian repeated hoarsely. Poirot's gaze travelled slowly around the room. Arrow slits, steel-lined walls, the door with its broken bolt still dangling. Apparently, he said softly, is the correct word. He looked at each of us in turn, and for the first time that night, the little smile vanished entirely. Because, mes amis, this is not suicide, this is murder. And the murder has been committed in a room locked and bolted from the inside, with no window large enough for a child and no other door. It is in fact the perfect, impossible crime. He turned back to the body of Sir Reginald Ravenswood, and his voice dropped to a murmur that only Hastings and I could hear. And Hercule Poirot has been invited to a house party for the express purpose of preventing it. Someone, it seems, has made a very great mistake. Chapter 4. The Impossible Crime. Poirot stood in the centre of the tower room, like a small, immaculate general surveying a battlefield. The local constable had come and gone, satisfied after one glance that Sir Reginald had shot himself, and that the bolt proved no one else could possibly be involved. The police surgeon had muttered about open and shut, and departed to play golf. Only Poirot remained, turning slowly on polished heels, green eyes glittering. He began with the door. He ran a gloved finger along the sheared bolt, examined the splintered oak, peered at the Yale lock now hanging drunkenly from one screw. Then he knelt, an operation requiring considerable care with the creases of his trousers, and studied the gap beneath the door. "Interesting," he murmured, "most interesting." He rose and crossed to the body. Sir Reginald had been moved to a leather sofa, a rug thrown over him out of decency. Poirot lifted the rug, studied the wound, lifted the dead man's right hand, then the left. Ah! Hastings and I, hovering like anxious acolytes, leaned forward. "Look, Hastings. The right temple, yes. The revolver found beneath the right hand. Yet observe the fingernails. Sir Reginald trimmed them with a cutter, not scissors. See the square ends. On the left hand, the nails are shorter, more worn. He was left-handed. Everyone remarked it at dinner, how he lifted his glass, how he signed the visitor's book yesterday. A left-handed man does not suddenly become right-handed for the most important action of his life." He replaced the rug gently. "Moreover, the angle of the wound is wrong. The bullet entered here, he touched his own right temple, travelling slightly downward. For suicide, the muzzle would have been pressed almost vertically. This was fired from 2 or 3 feet away." He turned to the typewriter. The suicide note still protruded, and this, Sir Reginald detested typewriters, clattering machines for women, he told me only yesterday. Miss Layton took all his dictation. Yet here is a note typed with 2 fingers. See the heavy impression on A and E, the slight overlap on the G. Someone who rarely types. Julian Hale, who had been standing white-faced by the arrow slit, gave a short, bitter laugh. Perhaps he wished to spare Clara the pain of taking down his confession. Or perhaps, Poirot said softly, the murderer is someone who types badly. Lady Margaret made a small choking sound and fled the room. Poirot moved to the revolver. He lifted it carefully with a silk handkerchief, sniffed the muzzle, examined the butt. 1 round fired, the other 5 chambers intact, prints, only Sir Reginald's own, very clear on the butt and the trigger. Curious. After suicide, one expects the gun to be dropped, perhaps to spin away. This lies neatly, almost lovingly placed. He looked up at the soundproofed walls. And the padding. Excellent for muffling sound. One could fire a second shot into the cork and felt, and no one outside would know whether it was the fatal shot or merely practice. He crossed to the fireplace, poked among the ashes with the tongs, then bent suddenly and retrieved something small and bright. A brass drawing pin, he announced, bent almost double. It has been fired into the wall at great velocity. See the distortion. Someone tested the padding with a bullet from this very revolver, then retrieved the pin to hide the hole. But one pin always escapes, n'est-ce pas? He slipped it into an envelope. Harold Ravenswood cleared his throat. All very clever, Mr. Poirot. But the door was bolted on the inside. The key was in the lock on the inside. The arrow slits are 4 inches wide. Unless the murderer is a ghost or a snake, I don't see how. Exactly. Poirot's eyes blazed. That is the beauty of it. The murderer wished us to say precisely that. But Hercule Poirot sees what others do not. He paced, hands clasped behind his back. Consider the sequence. Sir Reginald came here after dinner, portfolio under his arm, revolver in his pocket. He locked the Yale, threw the bolt, settled to work. At some moment between 10:15 and 11 o'clock, before most of us had even reached our bedrooms, someone entered this room, argued with him, shot him, arranged the scene, and left. The shot we heard at 11:30 was the second bullet, fired into the wall to convince us the murder had only just occurred. But the bolt, Harold began again. Poirot held up a finger. Patience. The bolt is the whole charm of the trick. It was thrown from the inside, yes, but it was unthrown, if I may coin a word, from the outside. Observe. He opened the door wide and pointed to the great steel bolt. On its underside, almost invisible unless one knew where to look, was a hair-fine scratch. Last night the bolt slid smoothly. This morning, a tiny groove. Something rubbed across the metal as it moved. He knelt again and produced a magnifying lens. Beneath the door, caught on a rough place in the stone threshold, gleamed a single black thread, no longer than a matchstick. Voila! Linen thread, strong yet fine. The murderer left the room, closed the door, passed this thread through the gap beneath, looped it round the bolt handle, and pulled. The bolt slid home. A sharp tug, the thread breaks, the fragment remains. He rose triumphantly. Simple, ingenious, almost perfect. Julian Hale stared at the thread as though it were a snake. Anyone could buy black thread. True, Poirot conceded, but this is bookbinder's linen thread, much favoured by architects for binding presentation drawings. And only one person in this house uses it regularly for that purpose. Every eye turned to Julian. The young man flushed dark red. I use white cord for my models. Everyone knows that. Poirot inclined his head. Exactly so. Which is why the real murderer chose black, to cast suspicion upon you, monsieur. The thread came from another source entirely. He tucked the fragment into a second envelope. 2 impossible things have been explained, he said quietly. How the murderer left the room, and how he convinced us the murder happened later than it did. The third, who had motive enough to plan such an elaborate death, that remains for tomorrow. He looked round the circle of pale, exhausted faces. Chapter 5. Motives in the Drawing Room. Sunlight fell in hard white slabs across the drawing-room carpet, merciless after the long night. The fire had been lit but gave no warmth. The room felt like a courtroom awaiting the judge. Poirot had arranged the chairs in a precise half-circle. He himself stood before the marble mantel, hands clasped behind his back, the very picture of a small green-eyed cat who has cornered 5 uneasy mice. We were all present. Lady Margaret, pale but composed in black. Harold Ravenswood already reaching for the decanter at 11 in the morning. Clara Layton upright, notebook closed for once. Lionel Forsyth polishing and repolishing his spectacles. Julian Hale standing apart by the window, fists clenched at his sides. Hastings and I sat to one side, trying to be invisible. Poirot began without preamble. Sir Reginald Ravenswood was murdered between 10:15 and 11 o'clock last night. The shot we heard at 11:30 was a charade. During that missing 45 minutes, any one of you could have climbed the spiral stair unseen. The house was in movement. Bedrooms were being sought. Lights switched off. Good nights exchanged. 45 minutes is a great deal of time when one has planned everything in advance. He let the silence stretch until Harold's glass rattled against his teeth. "Let us be brutal," Poirot continued. "Let us speak of motives. 5 people in this room wished Sir Reginald dead. 5 people profit, one way or another, by his death." He turned first to Lady Margaret. "Lady Ravenswood, 3 weeks ago your husband instructed his solicitors to begin divorce proceedings. The cause, your liaison with Mr. Julian Hale. The letters found in your jewel case were explicit. You would have left this house with nothing but an allowance your husband could stop at any moment. Now you inherit the London house, the settlement in the south of France, and your freedom. A powerful motive, madame." Lady Margaret lifted her chin. "I did not kill him." Poirot inclined his head and moved on. "Mr. Harold Ravenswood, your brother refused, for the last time, to pay debts of £23,000, run up at Newmarket and Deauville. Yesterday afternoon you begged him in the Guillaume library. He told you that after Monday's announcement he would be too much in the public eye to risk scandal. Your allowance would cease, and you would be well advised to enlist in the Foreign Legion. You left that interview shaking with rage." Harold tried to laugh. "Family quarrels, Poirot. Every brother does not inherit £160,000 on the death of the other." Poirot cut in gently. "Your motive, monsieur, is perhaps the oldest in the world. Money." Harold swallowed whiskey and said nothing. Poirot's gaze shifted to Clara Layton. "Mademoiselle, Sir Reginald discovered that for 18 months you had been selling photographs of his most secret designs to Mr. Casson of Glasgow. Last week he confronted you. You wept, you pleaded, you promised to return the money. He told you he would decide after the City Hall announcement whether to prosecute. Your entire future, reputation, liberty, hung upon his whim." Clara's knuckles were white on the notebook. "He forgave me," she whispered. "He said on Friday he would forget the whole affair." "Perhaps," Poirot said, "or perhaps he changed his mind when the final triumph was so close. Fear is a sharp motive, mademoiselle." He turned to Lionel Forsyth. "Monsieur Forsyth, the partnership accounts show a deficit of £18,000. Sir Reginald examined the ledgers only yesterday morning. He underlined certain entries in red ink and wrote beside them the words police. You were to be ruined, disgraced, imprisoned. £18,000 is a fortune to save a reputation." Forsyth's smile was glassy. "Reginald was theatrical. He would never have—" "He would," Poirot interrupted. "He told me so himself yesterday afternoon while walking in the rose garden. He said, Some men must be taught that even friendship has limits. You knew, monsieur, that after Monday there would be no mercy. Finally, Poirot faced Julian Hale. And you, Monsieur le Jeune Premier. 6 months ago, you brought Sir Reginald a design of genius. Curved glass walls, a spire of light, a building that would breathe. He praised it, then stole it. On Monday, the world will applaud Sir Reginald Ravenswood for your vision. You will receive nothing, not money, not credit, not even the satisfaction of justice. Last night you accused him before us all. You left the dining room white with fury. Tell me, Mr. Hale, when hatred is that strong, is murder far behind? Julian's voice shook. I hated him. God help me. I wished him dead 1,000 times, but I did not fire that bullet. Poirot surveyed the 5 faces: fear, defiance, calculation, despair. 5 motives, he said softly. 5 people who profit. Yet only one could have planned the impossible crime. Who understood the tower room's secrets? Who knew exactly how soundproof the walls were? Who possessed the cool nerve to fire a second shot into the padding and then walk downstairs to establish an alibi? He paused, letting the silence become unbearable. Tomorrow, he said at last, I shall tell you which one of you climbed those stairs carrying death in the shape of a Webley revolver. And I shall prove it so completely that even the murderer will applaud the ingenuity of Hercule Poirot. He bowed, very slightly. For now, mesdames et messieurs, I bid you good morning. Reflect, I beg you. Reflection is healthy. No one moved until Poirot had left the room. Then Harold reached for the decanter again. Lady Margaret stared at Julian with something close to pleading, and Lionel Forsyth began, very quietly, to laugh. Chapter 6. The Revelation. The drawing-room had been cleared of every chair except 6, set in a perfect semicircle facing the tall windows. Outside, a cold November rain slashed against the glass, turning the gardens to grey watercolours. Inside, the fire roared too loudly, as though trying to drown what was coming. Poirot entered last, closing the double doors with a soft click that sounded final. He carried nothing, no papers, no envelopes, only the calm certainty of a man who has arranged every piece of a puzzle exactly where he wants it. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, the time for suspicion is finished. Now comes certainty. He did not take a seat. He stood in the centre, small and immaculate, and let his gaze travel slowly across each face. Lady Margaret rigid in black lace, Harold already half drunk, though it was only 4 o'clock, Clara Layton clutching her notebook like a hymnal, Lionel Forsyth polishing his spectacles with a hand that trembled, Julian Hale standing because sitting felt too much like surrender. Poirot lifted one finger. First, the impossible doorway. We have all seen the black linen thread that pulled the bolt from outside. Clever, yes, but not clever enough. Because the thread was a blind, a false clue, planted to direct suspicion toward a young architect who binds his presentation drawings with white cord, never black. Someone wished us to look at Mr. Julian Hale and see a murderer. Julian exhaled, a sound almost of pain. Poirot continued. Second, the shot at 11:30, also a blind. The real murder took place earlier. The second bullet was fired into the soundproofed wall to give the killer an alibi. And one person above all needed that alibi. He turned to Lionel Forsyth. You, monsieur, were seen by the butler in the billiard room at 11:25, calmly potting the red. 5 minutes later, the shot was heard. Ergo, you could not have fired it, except that you had already fired the fatal shot 40 minutes earlier. Forsyth attempted a laugh. It came out dry. Absurd. The door was bolted. From the inside. Poirot agreed, but not by Sir Reginald. By you after you left the room. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a small object. A brass architectural drawing compass, one, leg sharpened to a needle, the other bent at a precise angle. Observe, last night, while Sir Reginald poured whisky and boasted of Monday's triumph, you asked to examine the final elevations. He turned to the plan chest. You took the Webley from his pocket. He trusted you, his partner of 20 years, and you shot him once, from 3 feet away, in the right temple. He fell forward across the desk. You then arranged the scene. Revolver beneath the right hand, suicide note typed with your 2 clumsy fingers. The same fingers that made the identical error on the partnership invoice marked in red yesterday morning, Reciept, for receipt. Forsyth had gone the colour of tallow. You pressed Sir Reginald's dead fingers to the butt of the gun to leave his prints. Then you left the room, closing the door. The Yale lock snapped shut. You were now outside a door that would shortly need to be bolted from within. He held up the compass. This little instrument, monsieur, was in your pocket. You inserted the sharpened leg through the small hole Sir Reginald had drilled in the bolt years ago. He intended to fit a decorative iron ring, but never did. The hole is exactly 3/16 of an inch. You twisted the compass from outside, the bent leg caught the bolt handle and drew it across. One smooth movement, the bolt shot home. You withdrew the compass, pocketed it, and descended the stairs. Forsyth tried to speak. Nothing came. Poirot's voice softened, almost kindly. You returned to the billiard room. At 11:30 precisely, you loaded a second cartridge, fired into the padded wall, the padding you yourself had specified when the tower was rebuilt, then laid the revolver on the table, calm as you please. The butler found you practicing cannons, perfect alibi. He laid the compass on the mantel with a small, deliberate click. But you made 3 errors, monsieur. First, the left-handed man shot in the right temple. Second, the typed note with your characteristic misspelling. Third, and fatal, you left the compass in your dressing-room pocket instead of destroying it. On the joint this morning, I found microscopic flecks of oak and a trace of gun oil. The laboratory in London confirmed it within the hour. Forsyth rose slowly, like a man in a dream. It was an accident, he whispered. He turned, he saw the gun, he laughed, said I wouldn't dare. We struggled, it went off, I panicked. The rest, arranging the scene. It happened almost without thought. Poirot regarded him steadily. £18,000 is a large sum to panic over, monsieur, and the compass trick required weeks of rehearsal. No, this was murder premeditated. You intended to let suspicion fall upon Mr. Hale, whose career you have also ruined with small, steady thefts of ideas over the years. 2 birds with 1 bullet, n'est-ce pas? Forsyth looked round the room as though seeing it for the first time. Lady Margaret would not meet his eyes. Julian Hale stared at him with something colder than hatred, contempt. Poirot nodded to the door, where 2 silent Scotland Yard men had appeared. Monsieur Lionel Forsyth, I arrest you for the murder of Sir Reginald Ravenswood. Forsyth did not resist. As the handcuffs clicked, he gave a small, broken laugh. All that steel and oak, he said, and in the end it was a brass compass that undid me. The doors closed behind him. The rain kept falling. Poirot turned to the others, and for the first time all day he permitted himself a small, satisfied smile. Justice, he said quietly, is the most precise instrument of all. Chapter 7. Justice Served. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the Surrey hills washed clean, and the air so sharp it tasted of iron. Ravenswood Chase looked smaller in the pale November light. as though the house itself had shrunk overnight, embarrassed by what it had sheltered. Lionel Forsyth had been taken away in a black police van just after breakfast. He had said almost nothing. Only once, as the handcuffs were checked for the last time, he looked back at the tower and gave a small, puzzled shake of the head, like a man waking from a long and unpleasant dream. The rest of us gathered in the hall because no one quite knew where else to be. The servants moved silently, carrying trays they barely needed. The great fireplace roared for no one. Every clock in the house seemed to tick more slowly, as though time itself were reluctant to leave the night behind. Lady Margaret came down first. She wore a travelling costume of charcoal grey and a hat with a veil thin enough to show that her eyes were dry. A taxi waited on the gravel. 2 suitcases already stood beside it. She paused at the foot of the stairs, looked once toward the closed door of the tower corridor, and then spoke to Poirot without turning. "I shall be in London by luncheon. After that, the south of France until the newspapers forget. Thank you, monsieur, for clarity." Poirot bowed. "Clarity is sometimes the only mercy left, madame." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Julian will receive what is his." "Everything," Poirot assured her. "The judges have already been informed. The City Hall will rise under the name it was born with." She nodded once, sharply, and walked out into the cold sunshine without looking back. The taxi door slammed. Gravel spurted. Lady Margaret Ravenswood left Ravenswood Chase forever. Harold Ravenswood appeared next, dressed for the city though he had nowhere particular to go. His eyes were red but steady. For the first time since our arrival, he smelled only of soap and shaving cream. "I've telephoned my broker," he said gruffly. "Debts will be paid by the end of the week. After that, well, I believe there's a cattle boat leaving Liverpool for Argentina on Tuesday. Fresh air, hard work, might be just the thing." He held out his hand to Poirot. "You've saved me from something worse than poverty, monsieur. I won't forget it." Poirot took the hand warmly. "One is never too old to begin again, mon ami." Harold managed a crooked smile, collected his hat and gloves from the butler, and followed his sister-in-law's path down the steps. The Bentley started with a roar that sounded almost cheerful. Clara Layton was waiting in the morning room. She had laid her notebook on the table and was closing it for the last time. "I have resigned, of course," she said quietly. "But before I go, monsieur, I wish to thank you. Sir Reginald's private papers are in order. There is a letter addressed to the Director of Public Prosecutions, withdrawing any complaint against me. He wrote it on Friday afternoon and left it for posting on Monday. He forgave me after all." Her voice trembled only once. Poirot's eyes softened. "A great man, sometimes a hard one, but just in the end. You will find another position, mademoiselle. A woman who can keep secrets as well as you can will never be without employment." She smiled, really smiled, for the first time since we had arrived, pressed the notebook into Poirot's hands as a keepsake, and left on foot down the drive. A small, neat figure growing smaller until the bend in the avenue took her from sight. Julian Hale lingered longest. He stood in the empty library among the rolls of plans and the smell of ink and cedar, turning over a brass model of his stolen spire. "They telephoned from the competition committee an hour ago," he said. "The building will be called the Hale Pavilion. My name on the foundation stone. I ought to feel triumph, I suppose." Poirot regarded him gently. "You feel the weight of a man's death, even a man who wronged you. That is the mark of a conscience, monsieur. and the beginning of wisdom." Julian set the model down carefully. "I shall design something better one day," he said, "something entirely my own, and I shall dedicate it to him all the same, the good and the bad together. That is what buildings do. They remember everything." He offered his hand. Poirot took it in both of his. "Build well, mon jeune ami. The world has need of light." Julian left without another word. We watched from the steps as he walked quickly down the drive, coat collar turned up against the wind, until he too disappeared among the copper beeches. The house was silent now, echoing and forlorn. The butler approached, almost apologetically. "Sir Reginald's solicitors are here, sir. They wish to know whether the tower room should be sealed, or—" Poirot considered the dark doorway at the end of the corridor. "No," he said at last. "Leave it open, sunlight and air. A room that has held death should be allowed to breathe again." He turned to Hastings and me. "Come, my friends, the Bentley waits. London, a good luncheon, and then, who knows, perhaps a week in Torquay. The English, seaside in November, is very restorative to the little grey cells." As we drove away down the avenue, I looked back once. Ravenswood Chase stood against the pale sky, part ancient manor, part white concrete fantasy, already beginning to look like a house in a story someone else would tell. The wireless mast glinted for a moment in a shaft of sunlight, then the trees closed behind us. Poirot settled into the corner of the seat, closed his eyes, and permitted himself the very smallest of smiles. "You see, Hastings," he murmured, "even the most perfect locked room is only perfect until Hercule Poirot is invited inside. After that, puffed, the walls themselves confess." The Bentley gathered speed. Behind us, the gates of Ravenswood Chase clanged shut, and the strangest weekend of 1928 passed into memory, into legend, and finally into silence. Chapter 8. The Compass and the Spire. The confession came not in the drawing-room, not before the assembled company, but in the tower room itself at 9:30 the following morning. Poirot had asked that only 3 people be present: Lionel Forsyth, Inspector Japp from Scotland Yard, and myself. The others had been sent away, some to London, some to their rooms, while the final threads were gathered. Forsyth looked smaller in daylight, his collar too large, his eyes ringed with sleepless purple. He had asked for the handcuffs to be removed for 5 minutes, just 5, and Japp had agreed. The man was broken already. Steel was no longer necessary. Poirot stood beneath the green-shaded lamp where Sir Reginald had died. On the desk lay the brass drawing compass, gleaming like an accusation. "Tell us, monsieur," Poirot said quietly. "Tell us exactly how it was done. The whole truth now, and perhaps the judge will remember that you did not run." Forsyth stared at the compass as though it were alive. "I rehearsed it for weeks," he began, his voice flat. "Every Thursday, when Reginald played golf, I came up here alone. The hole in the bolt had always irritated him. He had drilled it for a decorative ring he never fitted. I measured it with calipers, 3/16 of an inch. I bent a spare compass leg to exactly 37 degrees. It worked perfectly the first time I tried it. The bolt slid home like a bank vault." He passed a hand across his mouth. "I never meant murder, that is the truth. I came up that night to beg one last time. £18,000. I had papers ready, promissory notes, shares in a Canadian mine, anything." He laughed, said the game was over, said on Monday he would hand everything to the fraud squad, and watch me taken away in handcuffs. He turned to pour himself whiskey. The revolver was there on the desk. He had taken to carrying it since the letters. I picked it up. He saw the reflection in the window and spun round. We struggled. It went off, God help me! It went off." His voice cracked. He fell across the desk. Blood everywhere. I stood there, the gun in my hand, listening to my life ending. Then the months of rehearsal took over. I wiped the gun, pressed his fingers to it, typed the note. I can only type with 2 fingers, you know that. I took the compass from my pocket, passed it through the gap beneath the door, hooked the bolt, drew it across. The door was locked and bolted exactly as he would have left it. I pocketed the compass, went down to the billiard room, and waited for 11:30. He looked up, eyes hollow. I fired the second shot into the wall at the exact minute I had planned. The butler saw me potting the red at 11:25, and again at 11:35. Perfect. I thought it was perfect. Poirot spoke gently. And the black thread? Forsyth gave a ghost of a smile. That was malice. Julian's white cord was too obvious. I bought black bookbinder's thread in London and left a few inches caught on the threshold. I wanted the boy ruined as well. 2 scandals for the price of 1. He sank into the leather chair where Sir Reginald had died. "I have built cathedrals of glass and steel," he said wonderingly. "I have made buildings that will stand for centuries. And I destroyed everything with a brass compass, no longer than my hand." Inspector Japp stepped forward and replaced the handcuffs, not roughly. Poirot moved to the arrow slit and looked out over the wet gardens. "Vanity," he said almost to himself, "always vanity. Sir Reginald built a fortress to prove no one could touch him. You, monsieur, built a crime to prove no one could catch you. In the end, the fortress and the crime were the same thing, pride." Forsyth was led away. His footsteps echoed down the spiral stair, slower than they had come up. Japp lingered a moment. "Neatly done, Mr. Poirot, though I still don't see how you knew it was the compass and not the thread." Poirot smiled. "The thread was too perfect, mon ami, too exactly what one expects in stories. Real murderers are rarely so literary. And the groove on the bolt was not rubbed. It was scratched, a single clean line, made by metal, not cotton. The rest was psychology. Only a man who measures the world in 16ths of an inch would think of a compass as a key." Japp chuckled and left us alone in the tower. I crossed to the desk. The brass model of Julian's spire still stood where he had placed it yesterday. Sunlight struck the delicate ribs and flung tiny rainbows across the blood-stained blotting paper. Poirot joined me. "One day," he said softly, "this spire will rise above the river, and people will look up and feel hope. A man died for it, another will hang for it, and the building will not care. That is the strange consolation of architecture, n'est-ce pas? Stone and glass and light. They outlast our little tragedies." He picked up the compass, weighed it in his palm, then dropped it into his pocket. "A souvenir," he murmured. "A reminder that the smallest instrument can open the strongest door." We left the tower room together. Behind us the door stood open for the first time in years, and cold, clean air swept through the place where death had hidden behind steel and oak. Outside, the Bentley was waiting. Poirot paused on the steps. "Come, Hastings," he said. "London, luncheon at the Savoy, and then, who knows, perhaps a little holiday. Even Hercule Poirot is allowed to rest when the impossible has been made, once again perfectly simple." The car moved off down the avenue. In the driving mirror, Ravenswood Chase dwindled. Tower, spire, wireless mast, all of it shrinking to a child's toy, until the trees closed and the strangest house in Surrey was gone. Only the compass remained, riding in Poirot's pocket like a small cold heart that had finally stopped beating. Chapter 9. The Last Drawing. 3 weeks later, on a bitter December afternoon, Hercule Poirot sat alone in his flat at Whitehaven Mansions. The fire crackled with expensive coal, the curtains were drawn against the fog, and on the table before him lay a single large envelope bearing the crest of the Royal Institute of British Architects. George, his valet, had placed it there with the post, and then discreetly vanished. Poirot slit the envelope with the little ivory knife he kept for such ceremonies. Inside was a thick cream card and a smaller note in a hurried, impatient hand. The card was an invitation, the formal unveiling of the winning design for the new City Hall, to be known henceforth as the Hale Pavilion. The ceremony would take place in the Great Hall of the Institute on the 21st of January. Mr. Julian Hale requested the pleasure of the company of Monsieur Hercule Poirot, and hoped he would honour them by speaking for 5 minutes on the part played by clarity of thought in great architecture. Poirot turned the card over in his fingers, smiling at the careful wording. Then he unfolded the private note. "Monsieur, they have given me the commission after all. The judges were horrified when the truth came out, but they are also architects. They recognized genius even when it had been stolen. The building will rise exactly as I dreamed it, glass, light, air. Only now it will carry my name instead of his. I owe you more than I can ever repay. If you come on the 21st, I will have a seat reserved in the very front row, and afterwards I will show you the final model, the one I kept hidden in my lodgings all these months. There is a detail in the crown of the spire I should like you to see. It is very small, but I think you will understand." With gratitude that will last as long as the building itself, Julian Hale Poirot laid the note aside and leaned back, eyes half closed. Memory carried him back to Ravenswood Chase. The tower room, the smell of cordite, the brass compass that had opened a door no hand could touch. He rose, crossed to the window, and looked down at the grey river sliding past. Somewhere upstream, on a site already cleared beside the Thames, steel was rising where only drawings had existed before. A spire of light, Julian had called it. Poirot wondered what small detail waited at its crown, and whether it would be a memorial or an exorcism. A soft knock. George entered with the tea-tray. "Anything important in the post, sir?" Poirot returned to his chair and picked up the invitation again. "Yes, George. Very important. A young man is building the future, and he has asked me to stand witness." George poured tea with the solemnity of a priest. "Will you go, sir?" "Of course." Poirot accepted the cup. One does not refuse when justice and beauty invite one to the same table. He sipped, then added quietly, almost to himself, "Besides, I am curious to see what he has placed at the very top." The fire settled with a small sigh. Outside the fog thickened, swallowing London whole, but inside the flat the lamps burned steady and warm. Poirot sat for a long time, turning the invitation in his hands, until the winter dusk pressed against the windows like a living thing. At length he opened his desk, took out a sheet of heavy cream notepaper, and began to write in his neat continental hand. "My dear Mr. Hale, it will be my very great pleasure to accept." He paused, dipped the pen again, and added a single line beneath his signature. "And I already know what you have placed in the crown of the spire. It is the only ornament that could ever belong there." He blotted the letter, sealed it, and rang for George to post it at once. Then he sat back, folded his hands across his waistcoat, and allowed himself the smallest, most satisfied smile of the season. Somewhere in the fog, a young architect was drawing the last perfect line, and somewhere above the river, a tower of glass and light was learning how to remember and how to forgive. For Hercule Poirot, the case was closed in the only way that ever truly mattered. The building had begun. Chapter 10. The Crown of Light, the Great Hall of the Royal Institute of British Architects. The hall was packed. Architects in stiff collars, patrons in pearls, journalists with notebooks already open, all of them craning toward the great draped model that stood on the dais beneath a spotlight. A low hum of anticipation filled the air, the sound a city makes when it is about to be given a new heartbeat. Poirot sat in the front row, exactly as promised, between a delighted Hastings and a slightly overwhelmed Julian Hale. Julian looked thinner, but his eyes had regained the fierce brightness they had lost at Ravenswood Chase. He kept touching the edge of the velvet curtain that hid the model, as though reassuring himself it was real. At 3 o'clock precisely, the president of the Institute mounted the platform. Speeches were made, grateful, tactful, careful never to mention murder, forgery, or suicide. Then Julian was called forward. He did not speak for long. This building, he said simply, was born in anger and grief. It has been baptized in clearer water since. I hope that when you walk beneath its spire, you will feel only the second emotion, never the first. He pulled the cord. The velvet fell away. Gasps rippled outward like rings on a pond. The model was taller than a man, perfect in every rib and curve of glass. Sunlight from the clerestory windows struck the delicate steel framework and scattered into 1,000 moving shards of coloured light across the hall. At the very summit, so small that only those in the first 3 rows could see it, something glinted. Julian turned to Poirot. "Would you do us the honour, monsieur?" Poirot rose, climbed the 3 shallow steps, and stood beside the model. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke, quietly, yet his precise voice carried to the back of the hall. "Messieurs, mesdames, you see before you a building that almost died before it was born. It was stolen once, and a man died trying to keep the theft secret. Yet here it stands, more honest and more beautiful than it ever could have been under a false name." He reached up and touched the tiny object at the crown of the spire. Most of you will never notice this detail, and that is as it should be. Architecture must never shout its secrets. But at the very top, where the final girder meets the sky, Mr. Hale has placed a small brass compass, no larger than a coin, its legs opened exactly 37 degrees. It is the instrument that once opened a door that should have stayed forever shut. Now it opens the sky instead. A murmur of surprise, quickly hushed. Poirot's fingers lingered on the cool metal. It will be gilded before the real spire is raised, so that from the street it will appear only as a fleck of gold catching the sun. But those who know the story, and stories cling to buildings longer than to people, will understand. The compass is no longer a weapon. It is a reminder that even the smallest instrument in the right hands can turn murder into mercy and pride into light. He stepped back. "I give you the Hale Pavilion. May it stand for 1,000 years, and may every man and woman who passes beneath it feel for one unguarded moment the better angels of our nature." He bowed, first to Julian, then to the hall, and returned to his seat amid applause that began politely and grew until it shook the rafters. Afterwards, in the robing room where architects kept their ceremonial gowns, Julian closed the door and leaned against it as though his legs might betray him. "I thought they would laugh," he said, "or worse, be offended." "They understood," Poirot replied. "Art always understands forgiveness better than the law does." Julian produced a small velvet box and opened it. Inside lay the original brass compass, cleaned and polished, its fatal bend straightened forever. "I want you to have it," he said, "not as a souvenir of death, but of life, because without you it would still be hidden in Forsyth's drawer, and the spire would belong to a dead man's lie." Poirot took the compass, weighed it in his palm, and then, with a gesture so swift that Julian almost missed it, dropped it into the fire that burned in the grate. The brass glowed for a heartbeat, then sank among the coals. "Some instruments," Poirot said gently, "are better melted. Let the memories stay in the sky, not in at our pockets." Julian stared at the flames, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Then keep this instead." He handed Poirot a photograph, the finished steel framework of the real pavilion already rising beside the Thames, taken at dawn. At its summit, the gilded compass caught the first ray of sun and flung it back across the river like a promise. On the back, Julian had written only, "For the man who taught me that justice can also be beautiful." Poirot slipped the photograph into his breast pocket, directly over his heart. Outside, London traffic roared along the embankment, oblivious to the small ceremony that had just taken place. Inside, two men, one old, one young, stood in silence while a compass burned and a city learned how to forgive. Years later, when the Hale Pavilion was complete and its spire had become as familiar to Londoners as St. Paul's Dome, old men would sometimes point upward on clear evenings and tell children the story of the guidebooks never printed, how the fleck of gold at the very top was once the tool of a murderer, and how a small Belgian detective with brilliant moustaches turned it into a star. Most of the children would laugh and forget by morning, but some would remember. And on certain evenings, when the light was exactly right, the gilded compass would flash once, just once, like a wink across the river from the architect who had learned mercy, and the detective who had taught it to him. That was the only epitaph either of them ever needed.